So one thing.
Come on back, folks. It's time to start.
Repurpose all the. You have the gravitas.
Right, gravitas.
Growly. It's growly gravitas.
Loud.
I'm loud. He's got it right.
He's a New Yorker.
Yeah.
What would you expect?
Near the Hudson River. I jog.
What are we going to do?
We're going to have Susan and Frank are going to help us draw out themes and questions for the next half hour or so. And about
Oh, thank you very
go
much.
into the round table.
You want me to throw this away, Sue?
Oh, is that mine too?
I don't know.
Very sorry.
No, no.
Here.
I'll deal with it.
Okay.
I mean, if it. Hmm? Yeah. I mean, he'll.
We'll just sit here. We could just sit here. We'll go to the round table.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I teach with Mark, or at the same school anyway.
What do you teach there?
I teach the clinic, and I teach first year criminal law, and I teach law enforcement. Fun.
So I guess we'll let them join us
What year?
Yeah.
How many years?
when they get around
So
to
I'm
it.
the
So
third year.
I'm Frank Munger, and Susan Carl and I have been charged with just, like a little starter motor, getting the engine turning over. And it's clear from this morning's sessions that this panel doesn't need any leadership whatsoever. You've got lots of things to talk to each other about, and there's no reason why we should try to confine that. So first of all, let me say welcome, Justin. We have a additional participant in the discussion, and I'd also like to say thanks to Michael and Tony and Scott for making this all possible, and to all of you whose dedication as activists as well as teachers is really astounding. It's really been energizing and fascinating to sit here and listen to what people are working on. And I mean, my first instinct is to say right on, and then they get right off. I don't say much more than that. But what I'm going to do, I'm not going to try to confine this to certain themes. I mean, your presentations move in so many different directions and have so many interconnections, and you're much better at seeing them than I think that I am, certainly. But I want to drop a couple of new ideas. They won't be entirely new, but they weren't really stressed directly into the mix by way of maybe suggesting other things that could connect all of this together, or examples that what you're all talking about could be applied to. Let me see, I was talking to Amna earlier. I thought that her talk was just a wonderful one to begin all of this with. It's very much focused on the social movement right now, which maybe has the best chance of changing the discourse in a progressive way. I mean, the civil rights movement also had that deep transformative potential, whether it actually achieved it or not. It resonated in such a way. I mean, it transformed politics. I mean, it didn't really transform the lives of African Americans or other minorities directly, but it set the stage for, generations of rights talk after that. Unfortunately, a lot of it picked up by the right, and politics was carried on in a different way. I think that the Black Lives Movement has that same transformative potential. And one way to look at the sort of Trump activism is that there's been a rebound from the assertion of Black Lives Matter to a much more self-interested and narrow view of whose lives are at stake here, and a continuation of the sort of racial blindness about the consequence of saying what they've been saying a long time. But the level of activism at the grassroots, just a parallel in some way, is too obvious to miss. So I wanted to make 2 points, I guess. Not really points, they're kind of general oceans worth of discussion here. One has to do with globalization. I mean, some of you know that contrary to the earlier work I've done, I've moved offshore now and have been engaged in interviewing public interest lawyers in Asia and trying to make sense out of their lives, learning a lot from what I've read by all of you and heard you talking, many of you, for many years about, in a new context, with the idea of bringing it back to an environment I'm more familiar with. But there's a real advantage to being a complete stranger and trying to make sense out of a culture, a political structure, a legal scene that you know nothing about initially and isn't necessarily thought about or conducted in any terms that you can assume are familiar to ones that you know about. So that's been very helpful to me. But my point of reference has really always been here. I mean, it's not possible for me to adapt completely to the scenes that I've looked at in other places. So I want to start just by reflecting quickly on how globalization has run through what a lot of you have said. Sometimes I think when people talk about the current scene, especially racial inequality, but other kinds of inequalities, there's this kind of nostalgia for the civil rights movement. And I share that. But those times aren't these times. You know, we're really in a different place now. The civil rights movement itself and the aftermath, I mean, itself is a very complicated, multi-stage event, change things and move things on to a different situation. The Black Lives Movement is not the civil rights movement. It's taking place in a different context and on a different basis and setting us on a different course. And part of what's happened in the meantime, I mean, our society has been transformed in, not exclusively, but it's been transformed a great deal by the impact of globalization. The impact of globalization on our economy, the impact of globalization on the range of minorities that we have in this country now, and the interests that they bring, and the background that they bring, and the way all of those things interact. One of the major impacts of globalization, of course, on the economy is the way that it has fueled economic divisions. It's been one of the big drivers making the super rich what they are and driving down opportunities for those with fewer skills. Now, it's not just globalization. Doug Massey has really a wonderful article on globalization in which he says, look, the U.S. is faring far less well in this environment than many other countries in advanced industrialized democracies like Europe, because we do such a crappy job of redistributing what the benefits of globalization might be. Now, you know, Clinton and her people try to defend NAFTA and other trade agreements, saying that in net, you know, the bottom line has been that this country has made money. Sure. And it may have from globalization and free trade, but there's certainly a lot of people suffering that are not being taken into account. That's not to make Trump's case, because that's not the point that I'm trying to make. We had a deep division already in this country, and it's deeply racialized. That only gets worse under the effects of globalization, driving the top up and the bottom down. African Americans, especially poor African Americans, are the most disadvantaged of the disadvantaged, and so the differences get extreme. That's had a corrupting effect on our politics. The Hacker and Pearson book, which describes this dynamic in which the top 1% drive where public policy is going, only makes the non-distributive, anti-distributive effects of policy worse. It's a dynamic that's been fueled by globalization and exacerbates inequalities that are already at work in our society. So that's one of the realities. It's not that we have to look for globalization under every rock, but understanding the dynamic may lead us to direct our efforts in a particular direction. And so this leads to a second point that I want to make, which has to do with politics. We've had very little discussion of voting rights, although I know it's all in the back of your minds. And the distribution of access to political power. Social movements provide a kind of direct access, a confrontation. But there are other routes to power, and they've been used really to create the kind of structural inequality that Michael wants to talk about. It's not just out there in the ethos. It was created. I mean, let's go back all the way to the origins of racial divisions in this country. Let's just go back as far as the New Deal. I mean, we all know that the New Deal was a white deal. and that there are many ways in which minorities, particularly almost in terms, minority African Americans, were excluded from the benefits of the New Deal. So we have this wonderful package of social provision programs which distribute benefits in many ways to everybody except African American minorities, who were deliberately left to the tender mercies of local politicians and local discretion while nominally enjoying the same benefits. That's kind of an old story, but there are repercussions from that all through our history, right up to the present. Now, we're not even talking about the history of slavery. We're talking about a very deliberate legislative attempt to marginalize the political influence and benefits of a certain group might achieve from the welfare state. The way it's been described in a certain line of scholarship is that in some ways the legislation that was enacted during the civil rights movement was a second attempt to address the imbalance of the New Deal. It is a labor structure, it's a structure for housing, all the other things that the white majority got in the New Deal were then offered on a more egalitarian basis, but specifically in the context of the civil rights movement, setting off yet another dynamic in which the right wing capitalizes on this focus, and with an economy going to hell, then mobilizes working class whites for an anti-racial agenda. I mean, it just snowballs. We can bring that discourse forward to the present time, 2016, and watch how politics feeds into this racial division and many other points. It brings me to the point that I want to make is that in all the discussion that we've had this morning, not only about the focus that we should maintain, what are the goals of progressive change? How do we want the society transformed? But we've talked about many points of entry, different kinds of grassroots organizations, and social movement mobilization, but we haven't talked about legislation yet. We haven't talked about legislation. Now, legislation takes access to power. We've got some access to power. You can fight about redistricting if you make it your goal. You can fight, and we are, and indeed here's where law really comes to play a role, about voting rights, which make a hell of a difference. One of the reasons that voting rights are such a target of right-wing activists right now, yeah, there's a deep racism that you can find if you scratch the surface, but their goals are much more instrumental. I saw the Voting Rights Project had this demographic comparison. If the country had the same demography now that it had in 1988, Obama would have lost. Where he's really built power is among minority voters, the Hispanic, Latino, and especially African American, where he got the overwhelming majority of votes. That demographic shift gave him the edge that he needed to win. It's no surprise that voting rights is pushing back on those very minorities. It's quite instrumental. It's not just that they don't like certain minorities, they don't want them to have power. That's a fight that we can focus on. And that requires lawyers, it requires money, it requires a movement. I mean, the role that a movement played in the civil rights movement, to the extent that it changed anything in the 60s, this is something to mobilize for, I think. It's not the only thing, but I'm suggesting a rather different focus from the ones that have been suggested, only to throw it in the mix and to give us something additional to talk about. One final thing, too, and this is going to lead to what I think Susan's going to talk about. The discussion of lawyers and the different roles that lawyers play. We did come together to talk about lawyers and social movements, so maybe spend a second talking about lawyers. Scott's reference to what lawyers do for and to movements, quoting title of Sergeant Scheingold's book on lawyers and social movements, or it's their introductory chapter maybe, yeah. And it reminded me that in their analysis of what social movement lawyers do, they rely on the work of Michael McCann. And Michael McCann talks about the many different roles that lawyers can play. We can think about concrete activities, but he tries to describe them as a sort of different phases of social movement building, which might help us talk to each other about what we're discussing in the papers that we're giving. One is the framing phase of a social movement. What's the social movement about initially? And that's what I heard a number of papers really talking about, how to frame the issues that a social movement should be about. And there we encountered what you're calling structuration, but what other people might call discursive integration, that what group of ideas center people and their identity in a way that they can move forward in the way that you want. It's not easy because they've got to give up other pieces of their belief system in order to do it. You can't just sell them that on the idea that this thing is bad because if going there may mean they have to give up some other piece of their sense of individual identity. Very complicated process. But I think Black Lives Matter has the energy and a sort of multi-dimensional appeal, just the way Martin Luther King wasn't appealing only to the African American community. He spoke in broader issues, not submerging the plight of African Americans and the inequality, but showing that there were commonalities between where they were and what many other Americans were feeling as well. Really broad dimension appeal. And I think Black Lives Matter also has that potential. So framing, then, and I think this is where integrated advocacy really comes in, the next phase is selecting the strategies that move that agenda ahead. The third phase is that if you actually are able to achieve things, how do you make them work in the sort of institutional structure that we have? I don't believe we're going to sweep away all American institutions in order to have a more transformed society. I'd love to see it, but it ain't going to happen. So you've got to have strategies for working with people inside and from within to sustain the gains that you've made. And then finally, there's what McCann calls the legacy element. That's the transformed legal consciousness, and feeding that, fostering it in a way that makes it self-perpetuating. That's sort of Luke's third dimension. People begin to take it for granted, and that's when you start teaching your students that this is the way the world needs to be. We're not at that stage yet, but you'd like to reach the stage where you can pass that on. McCann writes about the change consciousness that people have. So at any rate, those are just a few ideas to think about as we go forward that weren't mentioned, at least in quite that way, but all of you gave me the ideas, you know, so, and you'll have others to suggest to each other.
Great. All right, so I'm going to just add a few things. I'm going to talk about the question of what is law, because we're talking about law and social movements. And I thought that there was a lot of really interesting synergies going on among all of the papers on that particular question. So the question of what kinds of law, and the question of state building. So starting with Amna's paper, because it started first, and she also, it seems to me, Amna and Justin are a new generation of social movement scholars and activists. And so a lot of there's sort of a freshness and newness to some of what a lot of what you're saying in your paper. And as I already told you, it made my toes tingle when I read it. I was like, oh, wow, this is so exciting. So this question about law as violence and brutality and oppression and subordination, including the idea that what social movement and activists are trying to do in the movement for Black Lives is to move law out of their communities, right? To take it out, to get rid of some of the oppressive, this type of law that has to do with brutality and violence and oppression, versus, and I think a number of other people talked about law as something that was generative, that was protective and supportive. And I think of Alicia's work and Bob's work and other people. Is there a way of thinking about law and bringing law into communities that is supportive and empowering instead of oppressive and brutal? And there's a history to this. I write about I have written about the prehistory of the civil rights movement long before there was a movement. So the late 19th and early 20th century racial justice organizing. And one of the things I really wanted to understand in writing about that was the gendered nature of the work and the role of the African American Women's Club movement. And I went in with no preconceptions about how I was going to describe that. But I think what those groups, they were a movement, they really were a movement, and incredibly successful given the constraints of the time. And I wrote about how they were trying to build a community, trying to build a structure of the state outside of white oppressive structures. So people were not thinking that there were civil rights lawyers who were working on racial equality, formal racial equality issues, but there's a lot of work in community building that had to do with keeping white power structures out of the community and building supportive institutions like hospitals and community services organizations and parks and boys clubs and men's clubs and women's clubs, municipal services, you name it. There was all of this work trying to do that because this was in the progressive period where many of these services were being built in white communities, but not in African American communities. But instead of the demand being, you come in and build this in our communities, the idea is you stay out and we're going to build up our own communities. And I think there's a resonance there with what Amna is talking about in terms of getting police out of, taking the use of policing as the means of social control in Black communities and other communities of color, transforming that into something that's more about bringing in mental health services, bringing in social services, getting police out of schools, getting schools to be about education and providing the supports for human flourishing instead of law as oppressive and brutal. I also think there's a long, complicated history and a huge literature on Black nationalism, which Justin is a scholar in. There's lots of kinds of Black nationalism, but again, sort of defined by this idea of building a community that's outside of an oppressive white power structure. The Panthers being part, but certainly not all of it. There's conservative Black nationalism, radical Black nationalism, and a whole bunch of stuff in between there. But I think those are all historical lessons that we maybe want to think some about when we're thinking about what this, and I agree completely. Paul was saying this is a third abolition movement. This is a new step, a new wave in this sort of historical process if we stay confined to the U.S. So reimagining what the state should look like. What should the state look like? Lawyers having a role in that. And the responsibility of the state to protect and enable, which was, I think, a theme that Sheila was talking a lot about. Alicia was talking about the development of cooperatives, building economic structures that are outside of the mainstream. And Tony with municipal equity, all of those were all different ideas about how to kind of use law and lawyering to build these alternatives. And then the next question is, well, how do lawyers and law professors figure into that? And I think this is where Harold's ideas about students and empowering law students and empowering incubators. And again, there's this historical resonance, right? So we go back to Charles Hamilton Houston at Howard Law School talking about lawyers as social engineers. So we see that sort of similarity or historical echoing and resonance there. And what can we teach our students that would be helpful? And I think here, the idea of lawyers' expertise in transforming systems, right? Lawyers can do a lot of things, but one thing lawyers can do is problem solve, and we can think about how to transformative institution building and teaching that, teaching discursive thinking skills. This goes to Michael's vocabulary, Michael's ideas about discursive reflection on what institutions do and how they do it. So the lawyer's ability to deconstruct ideas and look at the assumptions that are built into them. These are all things that maybe we need to be teaching our students. So let's see. And then some other themes that I heard, this notion of interdisciplinary cooperation. partnerships. Jennifer, Alicia, Tony, all talking about that. Tony talking about interdisciplinary work between medicine, architecture, and law. Right? This is another kind of important theme, I think, in thinking about how to transform law and lawyering. So inter-issue cooperation, and also sociology. We were talking about that. I think Sheila was talking about sociology, and again, that has historical resonance. I wrote an article saying that disparate impact, the theory of disparate impact, was invented by sociologists, by Republicans, moderate sociologists who worked for the National Urban League, and they had this view about that actually thinking about things through a disparate impact lens would be better than accusing people of the moral wrongdoing of discrimination, and that idea kind of ended up being transformed historically. Integrated advocacy, Scott's important term in his magnum opus that kind of synthesizes all of this history and all of these different techniques, and kind of is the call for what we need to do going forward. And along with that, also, I think specialization is really important, and coordination across strategies. And so here we've got Bob Chang's important work that's still litigating work, but he's talking about we're not going to just go to the Supreme Court. We're going to try to intervene and solve problems at a very early stage, so that we can, so that litigation has the right approach. One other point I want to make is, I heard this discussion about there are these different strategies and which is the right strategy. I think history proves that it's good to have a lot of different strategies on the table, from the moderate, from the politics of respectability, which I personally don't find. There's a big literature criticizing the politics of respectability that I never completely agreed with, because many of us like to be considered respectable, and so there's from that sort of the people who are not so interested in who just personally or whatever from their background or whatever are not people who are going to be on the radical vanguard of the movement, but still have a very important role to play. So you've got a vanguard that's pushing forward, that's threatening people and waking them up. And we had the idea of violence and the symbolism of really threatening to shake things up. So there could be a whole range of strategies that could work together and coordinate. The contradictory ideas can be valuable together, that there's a dialectic process as well as one that has to do with kind of being more consistent. And then I heard a lot about roadblocks, collaboration across systems, across the civil and criminal justice issues that Tony was identifying as a roadblock, the roadblocks in relationships between lawyers and non-lawyers, class conflicts. I think that's a really key issue globally and domestically, understanding the relationship between oppression and class. And various power imbalances, again, domestically and internationally. And this question about institutionalization and the benefits and trade-offs of institutionalization. As you become more institutionalized, you become more rigid. You become less radical, you become less flexible. But without institutions to support and carry on the work, do you lose it? Does it go away? Are you not more ethereal? If you can't capture and preserve it in institutions. The question of failure versus success. Sheila was talking about the failure of the equal justice lawsuits. I'm thinking those were big successes in a lot of ways, because it did definitely raise this question about environmental justice and put it on the map, and we're all now very aware of it, even if the litigation failed. Finally, coalition building, and the idea that we need to build a movement that's durable and multifaceted and kind of endures the test of time and preserves historical lessons. So those are some themes that I heard kind of crossing all of the papers.
That's a lot. You two are hired. Just want to offer something. John Britton, you guys know who John Britton is? Like in the 1980s, people who were in NCBL, National Conference of Black Lawyers, John Britton circulated an article by a guy named Paul Costello, which is called Racism as an Ideology. It was a Marxist piece. Have you seen it? I actually used that, I wrote a piece called For Critical Race Practitioners, which is, over the last couple of years, has been increasing in its SSRN readership thing. I mean, I forgotten about it completely, but people are reading it.
Probably being read in Eastern Europe.
Something like that. Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, I'll take it wherever it comes from, except Saudi Arabia. But he talked about racism and all kind of what Marx would call superstructural events as having a certain kind of pattern to them. As I read the pattern, what he was talking about, I imagined it as a pyramid, right? So it's like at the base, there are objective conditions, facts that anybody can see. Here's black people, here's Latino people, here's Asian people. There are disparities of political power, economic development, access to healthcare. These are all facts everybody can see. The next level is beliefs, and it involves fewer people. Everybody who sees these things doesn't necessarily come up with a construct about why it's so, right? The next level is customs and practices. People who share these beliefs don't all act on them. The guy who thinks that the reason why black folks are disproportionately in jail is because they are disposed to, that's a fact he sees. The belief is because they're disproportionately, because they're prone to criminal behavior. He's a shopkeeper, he follows a black person around in a store. So not everybody who has the belief acts on them. Then there are organizations that are focused on maintaining one set of beliefs or another. Then there's institutions like media, and each, as you go up the pyramid, fewer and fewer people are involved. Top of the pyramid is law, where people make laws that reinforce the pattern. And what I've been telling my students is that if you look at the civil rights movement, and I think Black Lives Matter is doing this also, and it's an issue. They focused almost entirely on that belief level. And the problem with the belief level is that the belief level is a response to objective conditions. If you don't change the objective conditions, some kind of explanation of inequality is going to come back up again. The other level that they went at was law, which is, fine, you got law, but law has to be implemented. It has, the resources have to be deployed to make law actually a reality beyond just a piece of legislation being passed or, a court judgment being issued. So that the civil rights movement focused on the top, the law part, and close to the bottom, the belief part, but they never addressed the objective conditions. The black women's movements that you're talking about, that you describe as nationalists, they were trying to change the objective conditions rather than the beliefs. So I think we have to kind of keep this in mind when we talk about things like transforming legal consciousness. That's a belief. If the objective conditions haven't changed, the ideas are going to reproduce themselves. That's straight Marxist, stuff, right? So there's a lot more. Obviously, legislation can also be regnant. I mean, it has been. When the civil rights movement transformed from litigation to community action was kind of harnessed to get legislation passed. Then the legislation's passed, and everybody's supposed to go home. When I was working as the director of the Washington Bureau, I had a meeting with a Yale Law School classmate of mine who was counsel to the committee, judiciary committee. And he said, Harold, you just stepped into this position. I need to tell you something. He said, the NAACP has a problem. I said, what's the problem? And I just got here. Tell me what it is. He said that when the Americans with Disabilities Act was being considered by Congress, there were wheelchairs all over the Capitol. He said, whenever we look at civil rights legislation being considered or amended, whatever, it's the same 4 or 5 guys in suits. So that the whole constituency was no longer present, no longer part of the equation. So any kind of legislation, I mean, I agree with Frank's notion that legislation is another option, but you don't just get a law passed and then that's it. Carl Clare wrote a lot about this with respect to the labor movement. They let their coalition subside, and the labor legislation just kind of fell apart. But if you want to look at some legislation, the Black Lives Matter people have a very good argument for reparations. That's it.
So how should we organize our discussion?
Yeah, how are we just doing
Well,
things now?
so this is a roundtable, which means that people should contribute their thoughts and ideas, questions and critiques to the discussion. And you just moderate to make sure it's not a free-for-all.
Well, would it make sense to kind of go around the table and just get everybody's thoughts at this point? Would that be a way of?
Sure.
We haven't heard from Evan yet, who is actually doing this out there successfully.
Is this helpful at all in your day-to-day work?
Yeah, well, certainly, of course, it's helpful, and there are many different angles and many different things, but I guess because I'm more of a doer than somebody who's thought deeply about the doing in the ways
I
you,
have a question for you, it might help you, which is, it's a particularly successful example of a movement that participated in changing people's attitudes. I mean, it came to the conclusion that it did, I think, because American public opinion had shifted. But that shift wasn't unassisted. So what did you do?
I wouldn't say, I wouldn't say it's because American opinion shifted, I'd say it's because we shifted it. And I usually would describe 4 things we needed to make this happen. And remember, of course, we're talking about winning the freedom to marry, which obviously, as you all know, is not the entirety of everything the broader LGBT movement wants, but it was a big thing and a big piece, and in my view, would be an engine of transformation that would be the gift that keeps on giving in the continuing work of our broader movement. But we needed 4 things in this more than 4 decades that it took to achieve it. This was not an overnight success. We needed, number 1, the Constitution. And by the Constitution, I mean, literally the Constitution, but the ideals, the guarantees our country offers, however imperfectly, and also the system of rule of law and the opportunity for citizen engagement and all the things that we as Americans, again, however imperfectly they are realized, are lucky to have, that not everybody has. But as we all know, and as you all have critiqued so well, the Constitution doesn't fulfill itself. So we needed 3 more things. We had the Constitution to work with. We needed a movement, a strategy, and a campaign. By movement, I mean to say, as you all have written about and talked about, that no one organization, no one person, no one battle, no one case, no one state, no one methodology, litigation, legislation, public education, direct action, electoral work, fundraising, no one year, no one decade alone achieved our victory. It took a movement of millions of conversations, millions of dollars raised and invested, many organizations, many players, many battles, many parts. But at the same time, the movement that yielded this victory was not just a random set of actions. There was also a strategy, and there was a campaign to drive that strategy and to leverage that movement. And so the first thing I was going to say when you sort of threw the question to me was, I think the degree to which it's helpful is to be measured by what is it you're trying to achieve. And I often, just to say one other quick thing, I often now in sharing these lessons with other causes and other countries and others who want to learn the lessons, I talk about the ladder of clarity that I think we did well on. The ladder of clarity begins with the top rung, because in my view, you should begin with where you're trying to go. We had clarity of goal. Not everybody agreed with this goal, but we didn't need everyone to agree. Those of us who did agree and who could bring in others, through the power of the clarity of the goal, were able to build what was needed. Clarity of goal, clarity of strategy, clarity of what I call vehicles, the programs and partnerships and work that's actually called for by the strategy to get to the goal. And clarity of action steps, the concrete specifics that we were able to give others, other organizations, other partners, other allies, other individuals, so that more and more and more could be brought to the work to drive the strategy to the goal. And so again, I think all of, from my point of view, as more of an activist than an academic, I would measure it based on what are you actually trying to achieve. And I think you can talk about a lot of different things, but it really, to me, is only real when it's measured against what are you actually trying to, what do you want? What are you trying to get to happen?
Before we go on, could I just, we've been joined by someone new. Could you tell us who you are?
I'm Kenneth Jost. I'm a journalist. I write Supreme Court Yearbook. I write my eponymous blog, Jost on Justice. I have been an adjunct professor at this distinguished law school, of which I am also a graduate. And because I had other obligations during the morning, I tended to those, so I couldn't come. But I hardly expected to find myself among merely a dozen other people. I thought I would be sitting in an audience, but I'm glad to join you. And although I'm a journalist, not an activist, I consider myself as a one-time Southern civil rights liberal, a devotee of the view that, what does Georgetown say? The law is but the means, but justice is the end.
That's what Georgetown said. And you're here as a journalist.
I'm here as a journalist.
I should ask the table because we hadn't actually expected this.
Oh,
So we expected people to be at the open session.
I see. I didn't know this was not open. And as I say, I had deadline things in the morning.
So
In any event, I'm probably not going to quote write anything specifically on this, so I'm here in the journalistic phrase. I'm gathering string.
and
As always, glad to see someone I count as my friend.
so I guess there really is a question about how we proceed with it. Is this something that's okay? Should we take a break and just talk about it among ourselves for a second? What do you want to do?
I just want a good headshot, that's all. Just,
Can you promise? Can you promise him a good headshot?
I mean, it seems to me if we want to have a productive and hard-charging conversation, which I'm interested in, then the conversation should be as background, and if you want to use anything as a quote, you should ask people afterwards.
And is that satisfactory to you?
Fine.
Is that satisfactory to everyone else? Okay, then, thank you on that. Let's go on.
And even though I've been an adjunct, I don't believe we've ever personally introduced it.
So I'm Michael Diamond.
Sorry.
So Evan, I have a question, because, you described this as a movement and with strategy, et cetera, and so it strikes me that your law school paper was about this, and then you ended up kind of, in some sense, carrying the ball home as a lawyer. But I wonder, because a lot of what we talked about is kind of the role of law and lawyers in larger movements and the role of those movements, particularly outside of organized groups. We never, or mobilized groups, we never answer your question. And his question made me think of the question that I'm about to ask you around same-sex marriage and LGBT movement in general. I mean, situate the kind of norm generation, norm entrepreneurship that I would say centered around people coming out into the larger legal strategy. Because one could say that the marriage movement never would have happened this quickly had there not been, at the level of norms and beliefs, a significant transformation and change that didn't come about, I would argue, from the law at all, but rather from a larger movement that said to people, come out, and change people's minds, change who the idea of, gays and lesbians are. They're your brothers, sisters, blah, 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 blah. So talk to me about and how that might translate into, I guess, more contemporary movements around Black Lives Matter, around other things. I mean, the civil rights movement, of course, was part and parcel about that, but about changing the ideology. But that was such a powerful moment, because I was part of that moment, as were you, given our age, in American society, where people came out and changed the idea that gay people are normal and can do things like get married. So where do you see that in the larger story about marriage equality?
So I guess a few points.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, when I talked about a movement in that taxonomy, I think it's relevant in two ways with regard to the success of our cause of winning marriage. One is that we were able to draw on a broader movement.
Right.
And not everybody in the movement necessarily knew they were part of something,
That's
you
right.
know, part of this or
Yeah.
that, or following a strategy or whatever. And you're absolutely right that the millions of conversations, the millions of claiming space, et cetera, that are part of coming out, and the tens of millions of people then who are affected by that, is part of that broader movement that may or may not, in people's understanding, have directly been connected to any one thing.
Right.
And we could draw on that. We needed that.
And that was kind of diffuse, I would say. in terms
Very
of-
diffuse.
Yeah.
Yes, and over decades. But the second relevance was that we needed a multitude of players beyond necessarily just the critical mass who are actually driving something.
Right.
And we're able to draw on that as well. So that's what I meant by that.
Right.
So, but Evan, you're not telling us who the we are. There's a we somehow, a mastermind behind this that you're,
Well, in
I
the
mean-
taxonomy, I'm giving you
that's
the,
very abstract. Who's the we?
well, abstract, come on.
Right.
Speaking the language.
Calling the
Right, so the fourth thing I listed there was a campaign.
Yeah.
And by a campaign, I mean to distinguish it from this multitudinous, abstract, diffused movement that was absolutely the context and the actors who contributed to achieving. But there was a critical mass of individuals and then organizations who came together and supported or were part of a campaign that literally was a very intentional, very individual, very real, very personal, not just one person, but a small group of players who were driving something that wasn't just this. And it wasn't just that diffuse.
Right.
But that diffuse.
Was that Lambda or something larger?
No, it was, well, it began, you could say it began at Lambda, because I was at Lambda when I began my part. Gay people have been seeking the freedom to marry for more than 4 decades. Stonewall was 1969. We usually say Stonewall as the benchmark, of course, as your writings indicate in the African American struggle. Of course, it began before Stonewall, but we talk about Stonewall in 1969 as launching this ongoing, now global LGBT movement. Within 3 years of Stonewall, there were cases brought by couples all across the country seeking the freedom to marry, one of which had even reached the U.S. Supreme Court by 1972. So marriage was always part of this as well, but that was diffuse. That was a movement and many different things happening.
Although I think you could read Stonewall as a protest against police abuse.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely,
there's a more direct connection to that than to
Yes.
marriage equality.
Yes.
And so some people have suggested that reading the story of marriage equality as kind of a lesson for other movements, which I think might be more radical, for example, environmental justice or transforming the police, that the marriage equality isn't really the best example because, again, it's the goals were strategic and they were very successful, but they were deeply conservative in a sense, the idea of integrating the military and then the idea of integrating marriage. So if you look at the African-American and Latino and transgender people who fought at Stonewall, I'm not sure that they would have selected that goal, and goals that they would have selected might not have been, and would not have been as easily achievable. So I just want to caution about the great success that's benefited everybody of the marriage equality movement. I want to caution us about extrapolating that into the more radical concerns that some of us have identified.
Well, I certainly agree that seeking the freedom to marry was not the only thing people were talking about, or even necessarily the thing people were talking about at the Stonewall Rebellion of the several days of rioting and other such things that launched this global movement. But it is also true that immediately, in the immediate aftermath, marriage was absolutely very much part of it, and relation, respect, et cetera. You could talk about a more radical, to use your phrase, set of goals that were absolutely part of the conversation and part of the atmosphere and part of the work. in the immediate aftermath of Stonewall, but you could also talk about it in a much more, you could talk about it almost really completely the opposite. You could say that what many people were seeking at that point was really just to be left alone. They really didn't have a broader policy outcome. They weren't dreaming big, even in terms that you would describe as the more radical goals. They just wanted their space to be left alone. And in that sense, you could look at the claim for marriage and other related kinds of that level claim as actually being not conservative, but actually quite transformational and bold in for what people wanted. And I think all of that is on a spectrum of a discussion that I think people here might have different ideas about what is radical, what isn't, and where does that fit in? And that's a fair thing. And I would never say that marriage was the only thing then or now.
I've had a quick question for you. I was like, of course, because of the way I'm positioned, I'm always thinking about comparisons between the movement I'm involved in and your movement. And I'm thinking about we had a policy table, Visions for Black Lives statement. Amna probably mentioned it. And it included economic justice issues, it included community control, environmental justice. All these issues are part of this broader platform. But, when thinking about parallels to your work, I'm trying to envision a legal outfit picking one of those and saying that we're going to try to bring in impact litigation. With this idea, I think there could be a case for it with this idea that it could itself, the litigation itself, could transform the culture. The Washington Post right now is running this series of articles on the history of policing in television and media. Some of you may have seen this. They talk about Dragnet, and they talk about the last 80 years of how policing itself has created this culture of admiration for law and order, and the police officer being assumed to be right when they shoot and kill someone, even if they're a child. And now we have these videos that for the first time in over 80 or 90 years is starting to undercut this broad assumption. I think hegemony is what Michael Diamond probably would term it as. And it seems like there could be a justification, a cultural justification for picking policing out of the large array of issues that have become part of the demands of the movement. There could be a justification for picking policing like marriage was picked, picking policing as a site to try to shift the broader culture. And I guess I'm wondering, did you have a similar experience where maybe during the Stonewall years there was a wide array of issues that people in the community wanted to face, but the selection of marriage, was that seen as a selection that was made on cultural grounds, or was it something that was made on the grounds of some jurisprudential concerns or doctrinal issues, or how did that decision get made?
Yeah. So first of all, just to be clear, I came about 10 years after Stonewall. So
We're not that old.
Not that old.
right.
And I remember it well.
I wrote my paper in 1983, but even then it was a paper. But the more serious and more important point is that there really was never a moment where quote unquote marriage was quote unquote was picked. Mm-hmm. That's not really how it worked. Marriage was a goal among many goals that many people put forward at various iterations throughout our movement, going back more than 4 decades. And that's the reason I tell the Stonewall part, that this wasn't something we came up with, in the year X. This was always part of we pursuing this. We then had 10 years of battling within the more activist elite about whether we should or shouldn't. And this was during the AIDS catastrophe. It was under Reagan. It was a small beleaguered band of organizations, a small activist elite. So there were huge debates, huge divisions. And by and large, I wasn't successful in moving that forward, though I was laying the foundations and arguing and persuading, and others agreed, but there were different sets of disagreement or resistance. There was sort of an ideological set of resistances that I could talk about, and then there was also a strategic and timing set of resistances. And this was roiling. What changed things was, first of all, a court in the second wave of marriage litigation. First wave was in the very early 70s, all lose. In the very late 80s, early 90s, another set of couples, not motivated by brilliant strategic anything, they wanted to get married, and they again went to court. And unlike what had ever happened before, we got a court on May 5th, 1993, to say you should have a day in court. I was then positioned to argue to my colleagues, whatever you thought before, the world just changed. We have our day in court. We're going to be able to engage this. I believed, most probably didn't at that point, we would be able to win. But also winning was not just going to be winning one court case in one state. This was going to be epic. It was going to change the movement. It was going to change the dialogue. It was going to affect all the other things we cared about. And whether you agreed or disagreed with it, you needed to take this seriously. Even then, it took another 15 to 20 years of battling in which many agreed, but others didn't agree. But it was the power of the events combined with the foundation of the arguments and so on that gave marriage the place. But what made it the central, powerful, resonant dialogue that people react to, they either see how successful it was or they don't like it and they want to sort of distinguish it or diss it, was not a conscious determination in a room full of people who decided on this, though there were rooms and there were people who did decide to move it forward. What really made it what it became was the extraordinary power and resonance of the thing itself and the way millions and millions of people responded to it. Nobody decided to make marriage the thing, and nor was marriage ever the one thing of this movement. But marriage turned out to be, as some of us had predicted, extraordinarily resonant and powerful.
Tony, you had your hand up first. Why don't you go?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. So recently, we stopped calling our projects, the Historic Black Church Program and Environmental Justice Clinic. We stopped calling our projects, and we started calling them legal political campaigns. Mm-hmm. And I thought that's what we needed to do. And I was impressively surprised when eyebrows went up around the faculty and around the decanal cabinet that seems awfully political. And then so welcome comments on that. But the related point. So last week I had two interesting experiences. One is I'm now part of sort of ministers only gatherings. And at one point, one of the deacons said, well, you're our lawyer. And my first response might have been Scott's response, which is, well, under ABA Rule 1.7 and 1.13, I'm not so sure. It's a dual role, and I'm not even licensed here. But my first reaction was, wow, this is important to you. That's never happened before, right? This is important to you. And then I got called out by a young woman, single mom, a bunch of kids who's being evicted as part of this accelerating displacement that's happening all over Miami and Miami-Dade County. And who's represented by Legal Services of Greater Miami, two former students who are great lawyers. And she yelled at me at this meeting, "You're not helping me." And I was so sort of taken aback, because usually I'm the heroic, diminutive Atticus Finch in these meetings. But wasn't that this is therapy for me? Wasn't that an opportunity to talk about the law is not going to help you? The only thing that's going to help you is politically organizing and mobilizing around the displacement and resegregation that's happening all over the city, and because so I'll stop there and just see if I can get therapeutic comments on those things.
When she said you're not helping me, did it occur to you she might be saying that you're not connecting to me?
I know, I heard it legalistically.
So I want to follow up on Paul's comment about marriage equality and maybe even the policing part of Black Lives Matter being a somewhat conservative position. Um, so the difference between what the political theorists talk about as goals and structures seems to be really important. And that suggests to me that the conversation in all of these areas is ongoing. If you were to win the changing of policing or the absence of police, as we had a paper seek last week in school, that doesn't change the structural disadvantage of blacks in urban ghettos, the rural poor, et cetera. So there are a number of issues of which marriage is a part, which policing is a part, that go well beyond those particular things. If the movements were to dissolve upon the success of marriage equality or changed or absence of policing, something would have been lost. We would have made modest changes in goals, right? So now gay folk can marry, black folk aren't going to be killed by police, but that doesn't change the nature of the poverty. It doesn't change the nature of the oppression. It doesn't change the nature of the society. And so this is a conversation that can't be resolved episodically with one episode. There is an ongoing broader conversation. And again, it seems to me that both of the things that your movements got or are in the process of trying to get, again, without wanting to be overly boring about this, I mean, the discursive effects of those kinds of things expand to other things. It allows a discussion to be more broadly engaged in, and the goal, it seems to me, is to do that, and then to figure out what the ultimate structural outcome ought to be. And I don't know that we know that. You know, to say equality, that's a sort of loose term. During the discussions in the morning, I think there was a question about whether economic development is transformative at all, or whether it just buys into a kind of capitalist mode of activity with some new winners, but lots of other losers. And so the questions really seem to me to be broader than these particular goal-related outcomes. So I want to throw that out there as a perhaps different way of thinking about this.
So
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I think that's precise. I mean, to people who've been saying no and talked about legislation, the whole thing I presented on was the Black Lives Matter policy platform, right? So I focused kind of on the big picture framing questions because I'm trying to, push a reframing in a sense. But there's 40 kind of policy briefs that are pushing different kinds of legislative reforms. And precisely in some sense, the ambition of the platform is to say, you think we're a movement that's about reforming policing. We're not just not about reforming policing, we're about ending policing and transforming the whole society. We see policing as connected to unemployment, lack of social services, lack of opportunity, all of those kinds of things in African American communities, et cetera. And so I think what you're talking about is precisely the kind of realignment the movement's trying to do. Now, how well connected the vision is to kind of grassroots mobilizations or uprisings. I think that, that kind of remains to be seen. But I think that's definitely what they're trying to do. And I would also, you said, I think winning the right to marry is a little different than police killings of black people ending. If we got to the point of police killings ending against black people, I think it would require reconfiguration of a different and I think deeper sort. And then the last part, which is a little bit going back to Frank's point on globalization, which now that I have the mic, I'll bring us to, which is I think the question of the global context for all of this stuff matters a lot, which I think, Michael, your point is getting to as well. Because I think in the law context, in the US context, it's very easy to kind of think about these questions as domestic. But of course, part of what made the civil rights movement and Black Power movements so compelling, or at least in some parts of it, was that they were situating themselves as in solidarity with or proxy with anti-colonial movements, kind of imagining and connecting the location of Black people in the United States as a colonized population fighting, the colonizing force. And so there was a sense that, there was a global context that's important to kind of take on. And that is happening now as well, right? So I didn't get into this in my talk or in the paper, but of course, one of the reasons why the vision document hasn't maybe produced some of the effects people wanted it to was because the position that they took on Israel ended up drawing and situating that as part of divesting from the U.S. military, ended up drawing so much controversy that it kind of sucked some of the wind out of the other, broader piece of the vision document. Which is all to say, and this, I think, I would be curious what, Jennifer specifically thinks about this as well. I think to the extent that we are invested in transformation of a serious sort, I think it's quite the puzzle to think about what it means to be in the United States doing that work. When the US is, in a sense, the center of reproducing all of these social structures here and around the world. And so, a friend of mine who does a lot of social movement work often says, even though I do the work here, I fully think that if we're going to have this kind of transformation, it's going to come from the global South. And so what that means for how we think about our work both here and in relation to people in the global South, I think I haven't really thought it through, but I think it's provocative and worth thinking about. And the last point I'll make, just to kind of put a footnote on this, is that I've been really moved by, and part of what's provoked me is some of this literature about situating Brown as, there's this article by, I can't remember who, some historian called Brown as a Cold War case, right? So the idea that the US integrated in part so that it could reassert US power abroad to show that we weren't so conservative. And so what that says in some sense is that the US is willing to make certain concessions as long as it consolidates the ultimate power of, and when you're talking about a war against Black people, that's a war against Black people, not just here, but around the whole world. So how does that situate the role or the questions about people of color in the United States, US power, and how that's contingent related to the way that the US exercises power around the world in other countries where there are a lot more Black and brown people?
If I could, I'd like to add just 2 quick points that sort of reflect your comment about globalization, just to come back to that for a second. So in Scott's talk, Scott talked about how lawyers and their, our envisioning of their role responds to movements. Over the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a lot more talk about that, about the role of social movements in driving forward progressive lawyering. But I was thinking, Scott, when you were talking about that, the timing is not random. There's been a lot of talk about rule of law generally and the role of social. You've written about this, which in some ways is a reflection of the emphasis of the United Nations and World Bank and all the rest talking about rule of law. But there's a way in which, for the rest of the world, rule of law means something that's not being reflected in this conversation. We have been talking today about law as structuring government and being part of the oppressive structure we want to change. Elsewhere, and I'm now picking up rule of law, not law generally, but rule of law is seen as a liberating agenda. It's an ideal. It doesn't have the specific structures that we're talking about here in the US, but it's seen as a disruption of power. That's what rule of law is about. It's a way of disrupting power. And I still think it has that sense that can be used here. I mean, we use the term human rights. It has some of that force behind it, again, being a disruption of power. And we shouldn't lose that sense that there's something about the rule of law that we do like and that we find hopeful. It's when we look at something we'd call not just police, but the police, well, police state is too specific, but it's police as an administrative style that takes care of and secures security. It's a way that law is used in a very different mode, and we have to kind of keep, Foucault writes about this, but hell with the philosophy. I mean, there are just 2 ways of thinking about law. One is a kind of top-down way of structuring power down. The other is a much more disruptive way of sort of bringing the needs and hopes of groups that are excluded not to bear in the power game. I think you have to try to keep that second one alive, even while you're criticizing the use of law in the other mode as a restrictive force.
And they're always going to be combined.
They are in our, in our just everyday discourse. We talk about rule of law and law and orders, that they're the same thing, but they're really not. They're two different ways of thinking about governance. And they're just kind of conflated in our language, but not in every language around the world.
So I have, hopefully I can remember all the little pieces I want to say by the time I get to the end of the pieces, but so I guess I would disagree about how people talk about rule of law outside the United States. I think it's very contextual. A lot of activists who I've worked with in the global south, and I'm thinking both of India and Mexico, are very critical of both the rhetoric of the rule of law and what the rule of law rhetoric turns into on the ground when it comes from institutions like the World Bank and so on. But even when it's picked up as a destabilizing force, the idea that you can have a good rule of law that's somehow divorced from neoliberalism and the global institutions of finance and power and so on, doesn't seem plausible to most of the people I work with. So in part, so here's where I'm not sure the connection I can make super clearly. But in part, that leads me to think about access to justice as a phrase and its ordinary term. Its ordinary use in the United States, it's like access to justice, right? The focus is on the individual getting access to the rule of law. And the idea is once people are funneled into the rule of law system, then they have access to justice. And an effort by me and many others to make it access to justice, right? The focus of the effort properly is to figure out what justice looks like. And then how you get access to it. And that effort for me has been easier to see from a distance and in conversation with people not in the United States because I feel it's too easy inside the United States to just end up in these conversations that are about the access part and much harder to step back and look globally at what's the meaning of the justice part and the interconnectedness of it. Inevitably, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So on the globalization point, which I think is, and I'm sorry, am I next?
Yes, you are.
I mean, the thing that bothers me after coming off of many years of environmental justice advocacy, both, with groups and also in court, is, you wonder what we're all doing in the system that we have and whether we're just tinkering. I got to feel like I'm tinkering at the margins of the system using the best tools that we have as lawyers. And increasingly, I'm just drawn to larger analysis, like, Saskia Sassen, I heard her recently about expulsions, about there's an economic logic, and it is global, actually. There's an economic logic to, she calls it expulsions because she doesn't want to say gentrification, because that is that can be highly localized. There's also a larger economic logic around which we're structuring so much of our society that then we see play out in a police state, for instance, or with regard to questions of what it looks like to, to be a migrant or an immigrant in a particular society. And I think it plays into, the Trump and the Brexit, there is a kind of logic to all this stuff that's happening, that it's hard when we're in particular communities around particular issues like policing in Black lives or environmental justice. I mean, we're so focused on the crisis, which I think it is, in our communities, in the crisis, and, helping people. So my whole presentation was about not the success of, like, whether we recognize environmental justice, but actually helping people in those communities stop putting this stuff in the communities, stop killing people. Right? It was a tremendous failure on that level, right? Because but if that's what we're caring about, like, how do you bring belief? How do you restructure what's happening? I mean, you get to a point of kind of depression about it because it's not clear that the tools we have are really intervening in a larger, logic that is frankly dominating, not just our society, but in the world. So how do we restructure using the tools that we have, using our legal thinking, the geography of opportunity, right? The kinds of wealth people hold. And so I guess that's where my work is turned, because otherwise it just feels like responding to crisis and tinkering. And 20 years later, we're still talking about civil rights and environmental justice, and these communities are still being killed. So, so to me, it's ultimately deeply unsatisfactory. And it comes out of our, neoliberal law schools and our models. I mean, it's the way we get paid. Let's be clear, right? It's the way the student debt, everything.
Yes.
I mean, it's hard for us, sitting around to even think radically when we're the very beneficiaries of the system that, we're critiquing. And so that's the thing that keeps me up at night. It's like, what is the way into that? Because otherwise, we're part of it, right? We're tinkering, as radical as we may sound. And I don't know the answer to that.
Bob wanted a chance.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Okay, Bob and then Alicia.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
go ahead, Bob.
Do you want to go first?
No,
Go
go
ahead.
you
No,
go.
you were-
No, you go.
So, Evan, I really appreciated the point about the clarity of goal, I guess. So with the Korematsu Center, one of the things that we think about in terms of each thing that we get involved in, it's about how it affects the lived material reality of the people that we care about. It's very amorphous in some ways. There's not the sort of issue or specific community that guides us. But I think once we have that as the core, then I think, Amna, you mentioned the thing that you talk about with your students, which is, what's your theory for social change? How is it that you get about there in terms of, thinking about strategy and things like that? And then I think about how sometimes we lose sight of these. And an example, I think, comes from Derek Bell's critique of BRAD, the NAACP litigation strategy, desegregation. I think that, at the core, it was about getting educational opportunities for Black children in a way that was going to transform the community. But at some point, and I think the theory was, well, if you get them into the same classrooms, that's going to be enough. They'll get the same education, they'll have the same teachers, they'll have the same books, the same schools. But we saw clearly that didn't work. It's sort of like the game of whack-a-mole. You win one, and it just pops up in a different way. And so in some ways, when I think about ethnic studies, why we've invested so heavily in ethnic studies in Arizona, part of it is that this was a program, Mexican-American Studies, that had actually been shown to improve graduation rates, to improve test scores. And it's funny because TUSD, the school there, also has African-American Studies and Pan-Asian Studies and Native American Studies, but those programs haven't been successful. And guess which programs are still there? Those are the ones that are still there. And then in some ways, in terms of thinking about this, it's also recognizing that as important as it is to win in Tucson and in Arizona, the attention that we're able to bring through our participation in the case and keeping this on the front and center is that we've actually seen ethnic studies proliferate in other states. It's when I talk to the parents and the students and the teachers there, it's very troubling to me because we talk about, isn't this terrible that we're 5 years into the case, it hasn't gone to trial yet, been up to the 9th once, back down before the district court. But in other states, you have these programs being adopted. But in some ways, that's the victory. And, Scott's co-author, Douglas Najane, the winning through losing. I think we've seen themes like that before. And, you know that very well also. And so I don't know where I'm exactly going with this, but I think that sometimes with us in the legal academy, I think we forget sometimes about the lived material reality of the people that we care about. I think sometimes we get caught up with regard to a certain kind of elitism with regard to the federal courts, with regard to the Supreme Court. We forget the importance of states. So then when you're thinking about issues like juvenile life without parole, yes, it matters at the Supreme Court level. But it also matters that there are 5 states where over half of the 2,000 kids are in juvenile life without parole. So if you're thinking about where to put your efforts and where to direct your students, you always have to go back to what is going to improve the lived material reality of the people that you care about. And I think that if we think about, even going to voting rights, with what we've seen happen with the Supreme Court and voting rights, well, what are we going to do about that? Are we going to get Congress to change things? I'm very skeptical about that. But then when I think about the work of Joaquin Avila, who passed the California Voting Rights Act, like how remarkable is that? Like why aren't more states doing that? We've been trying in Washington State a few years to we get further each time. And yes, there are flaws with our legislation, but we're getting closer each time. But I wonder about the investment or the lack of investment in states, and in part because of the way that the legal academy operates. So I would just like us to think about that. But, right.
Yeah. So for me, I think the one student's question was the first time that, I was, the one student that asked about how do you do this in rural areas, but really it was her second question. That was the hard question, because in some ways it's the question that I try to avoid every day. Because as a practicing lawyer, I don't have the, I can't afford not to confront it every day. And I think Sheila's point,
I'm sorry, Lisa, could you restate the second question?
the second question is, how do you, well, I can't restate it the exact same way she asked it, but the way she asked it is, how do you use these private systems to, or the way she asked it is, how do you use money from the private sector, or if not, where do you get the money? The public sector? Is that any better?
Right.
And as I understand her questioners, how I would re-ask the question is, how do you create change while working within the system at the same time? And so that I think, or at least, and I went up to her afterwards and we talked about it, because I think that to some extent that, and as I say, as somebody who's practicing law, right, and has to, because that's my job, right? And so, and I'd go beyond what Sheila's saying, and not only am I a beneficiary, but I'm replicating the system. So, so it's this schizophrenia, right? Of how do I use the system that exists at the same time that I'm trying to work to transform it or to support it, right? And that and that is really, it's difficult, because it is that do you get depressed, or it's like, there I am in class saying, what entity form should we create? That's the end all and be all. And so it's for me, that's the important lesson, right? To always have that schizophrenia, as uncomfortable as it might feel, to have to live with that dichotomy of, I'm working within a system while at the same time trying to do something to change it. And maybe the way I live with myself, right, is to work towards supporting groups that are trying to actually make change in that system. And so I intentionally represent the Black nationalist groups that I'm not sure, and I'm not sure it's transparent to the students that that's who they are. And so should I be making it more transparent, right? Am I just kind of well, if I made it more transparent, then, maybe there would be more concern with the fact that I'm choosing to represent these groups. Isn't it better to just kind of leave it quiet, and I'm representing these groups, and if they notice, they notice. If they don't,
Could I just say something? I gave a speech at the New England Clinical Conference last week, Friday, and I stayed around to visit some of the panels and stuff. And there was a young woman from Harvard Law School who said that she thought her job description was to be authentically herself in every context that she was in. I kind of like the sound of it. I mean, it's like if you're deciding that you're going to be authentically yourself in every situation that you're in, then any structure that impinges on that, you're going to have to resist, right? The other thing was Benjamin Barber. I mean,
I better quit my job.
well, how you resolve it, is up to
Harold will
But which,
Yeah, yeah.
we have many.
But then Benjamin Barber, Jihad versus McWorld, consumed and stuff. He uses the term civic schizophrenia for a process by which neoliberalism is transforming citizens into consumers. And that's structural, right? So that's more like what some of the other folks are saying. This requires some big, kind of pushback. But in terms of, every day, like I teach property. I mean, how more regnant can you be? I start the first case they read is Dred Scott, and that's a property case, and then we just kind of go on from there. But mind you, as Frank knows and Michael knows, I've gotten into a lot of trouble doing this. I mean, I've been around for a long time, and I've gotten in trouble almost every place I go because I do exactly what this girl said. This is me.
I was going to throw in there, I know many people in the movement often recite this quote from Audre Lorde saying that you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. And so this idea of trying to create change from the inside of institutions in that framework is a false consciousness, and you're just justifying your benefit from the privilege. But for me, I disagree with that statement in the sense that I just don't know where else we get the power from. And I enjoyed hearing Michael's description of power, and I feel like with the stakes as high as they are, it's irresponsible to advocate any power that some of us decide to get access to. The fear of the sellout is always there, and I think authenticity and worrying about respectability, individual identity, politics, I think that has its place. But in the grand scheme of things, if you have a chance to use some power for a movement, if that power happens to be power that emerges from your engagement with law, then so be it. If it happens to be power that emerges from your engagement within the academy or with some sort of economic structure that you have access to, so be it. But I do think that power, it is a power game. I think so in terms of theories of change, I think a lot of us have to think about what our theories of change what does it really entail us mobilizing. I had a talk at Evan's class earlier this week, and I was discussing how I tried to use the international forum, the UN, and I've been engaged in a lot of international litigation surrounding the movement for Black Lives because I believe that at the end of the day, we can't go to the same people who created our problems to solve our problems. And we were going to have to use other sources of power and influence besides the state, the domestic United States government, to try to shift on our issue. Like the anti-apartheid movement was able to go outside of the apartheid state and create international pressure, and they got power from outside of their nation's borders. That was my theory of change. But some people may have theories of change that emerge from their understanding of how to manipulate civil rights statutes, state constitutional levers. I know Barbara Ransby is pushing this idea of taking 3 or 4 cities and trying to create municipal change on these issues. So people have theories of change, but all the theories of change that I'm aware of, at the end of the day, they are going to be standing on a particular source of power that people feel like they have access to manipulating. And if we have our sources of power, I don't think we should really be ashamed of trying to use those for the movement. And, but I fear that the discourse around whether you can be the spook that sat by the door and try to create change from inside, or whether that's going to be by necessity a sellout move and it's hopeless. I think that discourse is it's a dangerous discourse because it keeps you focused on something besides power.
No, but power is distributed throughout society, and that's what I heard Michael saying.
Mm.
That power is distributed throughout society, and that this is just one site,
Right.
right, of power.
Right.
And there's power in communities, there's power in various places.
There's power
Right, and so.
anywhere if it
right.
can be mobilized. But
Yeah.
I guess I wanted to come back to a point that Harold made in relation to Alicia's comments. Who we are is actually a product of this, right? It's come out before. We are the same people who have been inculcated with a set of values, a set of norms, and that's who we are. And we can resist and we can critique, but who we are people who have been successful in navigating this set of norms, and we have internalized many of them. And so a question that comes up is, and I think I agree with you in terms of the dangerousness of this discussion, the question is, can we, in doing a critique, ever get outside of the norms that are us? And if we can't, I mean, we have to envision something that's completely different. This has to be torn down and rebuilt, and that's not what we do. In part because law is the reification of these norms and rules. And we defend that one way or another. So the real question would be, what is a radical? What does it mean to be a radical? What does it mean to completely move outside of the system that we have been both born into and succeeded in? What does that mean, and how do we accomplish that? And to the extent that we start being schizophrenic about this, it presents real problems. So I don't know the answer to this, but it seems to me to be an inherent question in this kind of debate. I came of legal, I became a lawyer in the 60s. And there was this appellation that was used of the radical lawyer. And it always struck me as an oxymoron. Right? There's not a possibility, it seems to me, of being a radical lawyer. And I've been struggling with that for the last 50 years.
Alicia, you had.
Well, I just in response to that, I think that's why Jennifer's points were so important around that forcing ourselves to be outside the system forces us to say, wait a minute, there's just not one conception of inconstitutionality even, or unconstitutionality. I mean, to think, oh, there's another system that conceives of this in a different way. I'm not saying it's the solution, but I think it at least shakes our ground a little bit.
Sorry, part of my response to that would be the whole not us thing, right? I mean, I go out of my law professor's office and I drive home and the cop pulls me over because of what, right? And then there's a dialogue between him and the fact that I'm a lawyer, the fact that has nothing to do with
Right.
what's going on. Right, so there's a level in which the schizophrenia doesn't affect me maybe quite as hard as it does some of you. I mean, I see the system every freaking day, right? I mean, you understand what I'm saying? Sorry, Tony, I didn't mean to.
Well, so to go to your comments, so one of the challenges that we have is how to talk about race, and I have that challenge, and my white students do as well, and my students of color have a different challenge on that score. And so how do we do that? So there was a big community meeting, and I may have told this story before, and the very powerful city commissioner's chief of staff is yelling at me, and he points his finger in my face and says, "You have incited these people." And, and, once again, it was like, wow, did you really say that? But I just got an email from my new university president's chief flag catcher, because she just got a letter from a group of ministers who was calling the president out for essentially exploiting their Jim Crow neighborhood and displacing everyone. And her email says, evidently X community wants some sort of financial contribution. Can we talk? And I almost emailed back, you have no idea. You just like have no idea. And so I didn't send that email. But one of the challenges is in, role challenges, commitment challenges, is privilege challenges, is trying to figure out how to talk about race, how to talk about class, how to talk about difference, how to negotiate with powerful people who, at some level, are deeply racist and don't want to have that conversation. I got a slap letter from one of the leading African American lawyers in Miami, at a big firm, who represents a billionaire developer, and he knows what he's doing. He wrote the letter. Am I allowed to call him out?
Interesting possibility. So, Scott, Susan pointed out to me you hadn't spoken yet, and she wanted me to call on you. While you're gathering your thoughts, I have two quick points that I
Mr.
want.
Cummings.
This is the cold call, right?
So I have 2 quick points I want to fill in, just to sort of fill up the space while
You
you're
don't answer
thinking.
that question?
Not phrased that way necessarily.
I'm sorry, do you have something to add to? Yeah.
No,
Well,
that was
maybe
really a
just
question.
continue,
Yeah.
but I don't, I guess, exactly what I just said, I don't know how to answer it phrased that way, but maybe this is responsive in some way. Or maybe it's not. But just to say, for me, a different kind of complexity in all of this work, for me, that becomes evident in leaving the United States, is that I, at least, and I think a lot of us from within the United States, you get so easy to imagine there is such a thing as like global South or the Black community,
Right.
or the gay community, right? And we all know that that's not true, right? We know deeply that that's not true. But to be in Mexico and to realize, working in Mexico and realizing 2 things. First of all, Mexico is the US of Central America, meaning Mexico is the oppressive,
Yes.
Immigration excluding, repressive power towards Central Americans who are migrating there for many of the same reasons. And therefore, that puts a real complicated twist on the rhetoric from the Mexican government about the U.S. And also, right, at the same time, to think all of this, the sort of push from my work within Mexico to open up U.S. immigration is totally connected to a question about economic equality in the United States and Black Lives Matter, and to the economic statistics about who the only group is who looks like they are negatively affected by low-wage immigration, which is people who don't have a high school diploma in the U.S., and that is overwhelmingly people of color, many of whom are African American. And to understand that these aren't contradictions, they're simultaneous truths, and to figure out how to work within that world of simultaneous truth. It's not my job, I don't feel, to say to Mexican activists, well, what about the impact on poor people of color in the United States of flooding the low-wage job market. But I do feel like it's incumbent on me to ask myself that question in terms of the work that I choose to do. And so, I don't know, that may be a response or may not be a response at all, but it were some of the things I was thinking about as you started.
Do you talk to the Mexicans about their racism?
Oh, sure, but that's also, you know, just,
That's enormous, enormous.
well, except I worked,
Racism in Latin America.
Oh, right.
in Latin America and in the US, right? I worked for years at an immigrant workers center where people were openly racist, particularly toward Black workers in their world. They weren't so happy that I was gay either, and that I was Jewish was just a mess, right? And there was no way to function as a membership organization unless we actually talked about those things,
Yeah,
right?
I just think that sometimes like people from the global north interact with the elite, you know, who are the lawyers generally in Latin America, without ever discussing the legacy of slavery and racism that
Sure.
you know, we're talking about we're talking like 5 times as many people of African descent in Latin America as there are in the United States, and they're at the bottom of the social and economic ladder.
It also, but then again, right, Brazil, you can't not have that conversation. Mexico, people think that the conversation is about indigenous versus Spanish people, but it's a,
lot of people in Mexico. I mean, I worked with a group called Afro America 21, which came out right after the Pope apologized for slavery. And I met Afro-Paraguayans. I mean,
Sure.
you know, I mean, it's pretty much pervasive.
Different. It's just
I
different.
have one thing to add, which is this question about economics and strategy for economic empowerment and economic justice. I think there's some real, that has been so intractable. And I think maybe that's not a mistake that marriage equality came before ENDA, for example. You know, that actually attacking economic power is a much harder thing to do. The same with Brown. I mean, the organizers who are working on racial justice issues through the 20th century, Brown wasn't number one on their agenda. It was if you look at Lauren Miller's book about who was part of the work, civil rights lawyer, racial justice lawyer, and he writes a whole book. And to my surprise, when I finally went and read the book, there's less than a chapter on Brown, and there's all this other stuff in his book about all these other issues and all these other campaigns. It's just that that's the one that actually took off and succeeded. So I wonder if there's, you know, when we talk about the economics issues, I don't think it's that people haven't been trying historically for a long, long time. It's just that it's a lot harder to figure out how to take that stuff on.
I guess the thing I would add here would be linking that back up to, I think, the point that Evan made earlier about, I don't know, which I took to be a little bit about agency versus structure in social movements. So there's a question about intentionality and how marriage got positioned in a way that then made it the thing that happened, and all these other things didn't happen. And one thing that Susan's comment just reminded me is that in these movements, part of what movements are doing, back to Michael's earlier discussion, is framing issues. And when you're framing issues in a society that has a certain set of values, the issues that end up getting traction are ones that have resonance with mainstream values. And so to the extent that we see Brown being the thing that out of all the welter of activism, radical to mainstream that's happening in this moment, that becomes the iconic decision, that marriage becomes the iconic element of the LGBT rights movement right now, is in part about how it relates to the way people in our society think about these issues more broadly, which I think goes back to Paul's earlier point about the sort of radical versus mainstream, and then how it relates to law. For me, the discussion is a lot about radical versus mainstream and how those ideas get advanced in politics. Law is an overlay on that, And law can make things more mainstream or less. But underlying it all, for me, is a question about which kind of values we want to put our own capital and our own resources and our own investments behind in order to push forward. Law can be a force, as Frank said, for good and for bad. But I think it's important that we remain optimistic about what law can do. I think it's easy, particularly when you sort of study yourself and what you do for a long period of time, to see the problems and the limits. But I think that if you were in a different space, you might see different kinds of problems and limits. And one of the things that is generative to me about these discussions is that although we are all very good at identifying the problems and the limits, I come away from them feeling inspired still about the potential and about the need to continue on, even in the face of disillusionment, which I think is sort of an intrinsic part of being a part of outsider challenges to power. That doesn't go away.
So this really is a good place for me to stick my 2 cents worth in too, because I wanted to try to turn the discussion toward more positive. I mean, we're kind of wallowing in our inability to do anything about it, whether it's power structures or identities that we can't struggle with and so on. There are limits to what kind of change we can bring about. We all realize that, and they're really tough problems to face. But the important thing is that we feel that we should be doing something and can do something. The question is what and how, and we're trying to learn as best we can what works best under the circumstances that we face. Identities are complex. We all have one, and yet people who are subjected to or grow up in similar circumstances or nearly identical circumstances can have identities that are quite radically different. I mean, identities are partly about relationships that have an effect on you, but also partly about a narrative of identity that you create out of your own experiences, and those are not predetermined. They can be reshaped as we move forward, and we can learn, which is what we want to do, and hopefully have less of whatever we don't value in our identities and strengthen the features that we like. So the second thing I want to mention, and this is with respect to what you were talking about and what so many others, Tony and also Sheila, the concrete projects that you've really been working with on the ground, which are really an important part of the way forward. I mean, if we can think of a bigger opening at some point, we will do that. But the things that you're working on are keeping alive both ideals and the hope that we can achieve them, and should at least keep making the effort. I wanted to come back to the notion of legislative strategies, because, for example, in the context of co-ops, I also want to ask you about Detroit, too, which is an interesting place to try to put co-ops
He
together.
said earlier, when we met this morning, it's like he was going to open up by saying, what about Detroit?
Detroit is the future. So is that, of course, the left doesn't have overwhelming legislative strength, but part of the strength that you can have lies outside the legislature in the way that you use media and the way you push for incremental goals, just exactly the way minority interests do, by using the it's the other side of trend and collective action problems. What you do is you concentrate the power that you do have on limited goals that then open up other possibilities. So it's conceivable that small changes in a financing law, small changes in compensation for legal representation, small changes in the way corporate law is structured could have huge ramifications. They wouldn't necessarily be resisted by courts or anyone else. They just become part of the law and then a tool that can be pushed farther. You can see this happening in all kinds of even very repressive environments. I mean, Rachel Stern has a wonderful book about environmental litigation in China, which talks about the Chinese, in spite of themselves, having to face the consequences of having law on this. And lo and behold, some people take it seriously, and including quite conservative justices who say, we're serving the state, we're going to carry out what the law says, and it turns out to have implications. So the law itself is worth fighting for. I mean, you don't have people that are going to actually implement it, then it's not worth fighting for. But you've got people on the ground who are willing to use a lot of creativity and energy and bring what resources they can to bear to try to push it forward. So I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there really are strategies to go forward with. They require thinking through what your role as a lawyer is, of course, and then facilitating achieving the goal that the people you're working for want. And there are lots of different strategies to think about.
But I wonder if
Just
those
saying.
strategies are legislative.
Some are, I think.
Yeah, so I know you have a lot to say about it, so I'm.
No, no, no. No.
Well, we can think of.
I mean, some of them are, but it's,
Yeah.
so if we want to get at, because ultimately I'm not depressed, I just want to say that.
Good.
Neither am I.
Okay, good. I was
I'm actually
beginning to
quite-
wonder, listening to what we were saying.
Yeah, no, but, yeah, because I wouldn't be still, trying and doing this stuff. I actually think there are openings in intervention. And I think a lot of the transactional work that the clinics do, and I think that a lot of us are doing, in terms of helping people in communities and helping set up new structures, whether they're worker co-ops or, community land trust or, other kinds of wealth building, collective wealth building things. And I think a lot of this is happening in Detroit, I'm happy to see, are the kinds of interventions that do make a difference, actually, in bringing communities back and stabilizing them against displacements, against, notwithstanding the larger economic structure. So I do think, I mean, I would be depressed if I didn't believe in law and legal tools. And I think, of course, but we always, I like, right, what Alicia said, but we always have to be self-critical and, always
Absolutely.
self-conscious about even those things, right? To say how
Yep.
far, and that's what makes us, I think, good. And that's why we're sitting at this table having this conversation. So I do believe, I just want to say, I'm not sure, I would say policy that sometimes ends up as legislation. So a lot of the work I'm doing on land use and urban stuff is actually at the local level, which is a level that we don't talk about a lot. I mean,
Right.
some of us have, but there's a lot to be done there because of, in fact, where most people's lives are affected, it's at that level, right? What mayors do, what, city council people do, and the kinds of land use and others decisions.
And
So,
in precisely the neighborhoods that are likely to need your assistance most, there's a kind of vacuum.
yeah, exactly.
And we were talking about this. I mean, Detroit is certainly one of the biggest power vacuums where lots of things are not being enforced that would be in other cities. And it's a moment. I mean, if you could generate just a modest amount of pressure where you could have a great deal of influence on the way policies are brought back online as the city grows again.
And enforce at the administrative level.
Right,
Right.
exactly.
Right, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, that's a huge area of practice.
Yeah.
But I'm sure Alicia has lots.
Well, no, one of the things, actually, because it was Frank's point very early on that I had a conversation with our university government relations person. He's he's the person that goes, it's a public university, so he's the person that goes around the state kind of saying, look at all that we do for the state. And he grabbed me at the end of the meeting, and I'm going to say I was like blown away. He said, do you think there's anybody at the law school who would be willing to work with public policy to change redistricting in the state? And I thought,
Whoa.
that was exactly my reaction, because our legislature is a mess. It's a horrible legislature, and it's a mess. And so to think, here's a public university and having the law school and the public policy school being able to maybe, and so I think, I frankly, it never would have occurred to me because I thought, oh, no way, that's just never going to happen. But here's the government relations person thinking that the university has a role to play in changing the way that we do redistricting in place for before the next census.
Obama's going to work on that when he steps down. He's
Oh, did
announced
he
that
say
he's going to
that?
work on redistricting. Yeah.
Well, that's the key to the
Listen.
future. Sure. Electoral. That goes back to your point about voting rights.
So
Right.
optimism
And
seems
that's
to
why-
be a conversation stopper.
Right, no.
So I'll say, with whatever the intellectual constraints, whatever the problems are, the obstacles, I remain eternally
Yeah.
optimistic about the idea of accomplishing things,
Yeah.
whatever they are,
I agree.
to improve the condition of someone. And not only that, but for my own kind of well-being, to think that I've made the effort to do something. And so both of those things leave me with an optimism and a willingness to go on these kinds of issues. So I don't think it's a showstopper. I think it's kind of the beginning of the continuation. You know?
It's a moral mandate
And Justin's
and much more fun.
absolutely right, that we have tools and power we can deploy. I mean, I actually agree with you completely.
I mean, I have to say, for me, it's like, so I graduated from law school in 2004. Right, so my first year of law school is 9/11.
Wow.
And in particular, given, that my name is very Muslim and I grew up in a Muslim family, it's a very particular political moment of feeling very kind of unable in a way to participate or engage in critique or any of that kind of thing for all sorts of reasons that I don't need to belabor right now. But, I have spent my career doing public interest lawyering, and felt like what I was doing was the least bad alternative, but not that excited about it until Black Lives Matter. And so even though in some sense I'm feeling freer to articulate deeper critiques in a way that I think a lot of people are because the movement is creating space for them, I'm much more excited about being a lawyer than I ever have been. And I can't say that I can entirely name that, but I think it's partly because the movement, and it's not, in some, it's not just Black Lives Matter. It's also, the immigrant rights movement, what's happening at the Dakota Pipeline. I mean, it's like all Occupy. I mean, all of these different movements, because they're signaling not just a deep satisfaction with the state of affairs, which is a lot of what we've been doing, and academics are good and smart people are good at doing, but also there is the regenerative project of not only is this bad, but we have to do something to make things better. And we might not have the answers, but we know a lot of the old processes didn't lead to the outcomes that we wanted. So that kind of experimentalism has been also very rejuvenating. And so, yeah, I mean, so you were soliciting, I think, Frank, the optimism point. So I think that there is space right now to do a lot of creative work and thinking. I think the ouster of the prosecutors in Chicago and Cleveland, while on the one hand are
An example,
creative work and thinking, I think the ouster of the prosecutors in Chicago and Cleveland, while on the one hand are really minor blips because some other prosecutors are installed and they're probably not going to be all that different, the idea that racial justice concerns can push a prosecutor out of office is, an opening. So I think that there have been openings that have been created to do different kinds of work in ways that are really important.
And I'll chime in and be optimistic also. I know, Scott, I was at a conference with you just last week. I'm seeing him every week now. But
Where's it going to be next
Stick with
week?
me.
The world.
That's good for me.
But we ended on an optimistic note there too. And one thing that led us to be optimistic was the fact that these movements are not limiting themselves to traditional visions of justice. They're trying to be more aspirational. So we were thinking about the movement for Black Lives and how it's not demanding rights. It's going beyond civil rights. It's going beyond the constitutional provisions that may govern policing, Fourth Amendment or 14th Amendment, and they're trying to critique entire institutions and asking how can we remake these institutions to express our values, and we're not going to be limited by the existing universe of understandings or practices or things that are currently seen as the status quo. So this ability to say, well, we would like to see an abolition of police and an abolition of prisons, that should be a really inspiring thing for us because it shows that the people are hopeful. They think that they can achieve something that is beyond the bounds of what's currently demanded by the Constitution. That's in direct opposition to what you see in the Ferguson report, for example. They would like, their only ambition is to get people to reach constitutional standards, which are very poor in the first place. So another inspiring thing for us to try to get to, we're not there yet, I don't think, but the question becomes, can we get to a place where we meet the people and their aspirational vision of going beyond rights? And I think we also talked about Michelle Alexander, how she decided that she had to quit the profession and join Union Theological Seminary because she saw an opening to go beyond traditional civil rights reform, and she needed to understand what ethical basis this new structure should be based on. And she thought that she needed a more involved understanding of the ethics and the morality and the spirituality underlying another system of relating to people and another system of creating safety and things like that. So those are so the possibilities have grown, the possibilities have expanded, and it's an exciting time to be around when the possibilities are expanding so much.
Well, so this looks like we've reached the end of the discussion. So I just have a couple of closing remarks to make. So the first one is this so far exceeded expectations, and my expectations were very high. So I can't think of a better group of people to have this discussion and to do this. And so I appreciate all of you coming and participating, contributing, and I thank you all for that. This ongoing discussion is something that it seems to me that it's really important for us to have. It's really important for us to convey this to our students and have them begin thinking about things differently than they may have done in the past. And then one hopes that they then go out and convey this to the next and the next and the next. So in terms of the optimism, I think this is all part of it. So the best thing I can say is thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Mike. Yeah, this was,
And Tony and Scott.
And Scott, yes.
Yep.
Well,
Here, here. And thank you, Evan, for being here.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
always great to have you.
and can I ask a question? Well, I don't know. what-
Second question, you mean?
Yeah. Well, so I don't know about you folks, but as someone who's trying to do, practical on the ground work and also, theorize it simultaneously, there are every day, I don't know about the rest of you, but every day issues come across the transom that are really hard and that I do not know the answer to. And it's not like I can't research it. No, I really don't know how, because there are multiple ways to answer it and to deal with it. And if we don't get together like this on a periodic basis, it's really hard to find space to work through it. I mean, I have long lists of questions to work through, and I just wonder how. And conferences are fine and dandy, but you really don't get to. You're busy. You're going to a conference. So I just, as a follow-up, is this a good model? Should we try to do this some more? Should it even include students? Should it just be really? And I don't know what I haven't gone to the schmoozes in years, so I don't know. That's a sort of another model, but are there other models of sort of, I don't know. I don't even know what to call this dialogue.
I guess it depends on what the goals are. For me, in the last few years, the things that have been the most intellectually productive are like something that Justin organized a month ago at UCLA, things where it's like a small group of people, so something like this, but where people are not presenting papers, because I think that there's just limitations to that format in terms of engaging deeply with any particular set of ideas. And either everyone reads one text, and that was the revision to the Bell case book, and so everyone read different chapters, and then there were assigned commentators, people responded, and then people people presented on it, and people responded. Or I've been to other workshops where, like 4 of us would be presenting papers, but the author wouldn't present them, someone else would present it, and it would be based on discussion. So I think if the goal is to reach students, that's not the thing. If the goal is that we think that there's a set of ideas that need to be more deeply explored and that to do it in a better way, community would be helpful, then I think this kind of model where it's like you actually do close readings of things and discuss them when you get together in a smaller number of presentations or papers, for me has been the most generative, but that's just my recent experience.
Well, let me say that it's really been very useful for me, an opportunity to read things that are in progress and to meet people that I hadn't met before. It's been very stimulating. I can imagine other variations on this, though, with somewhat more defined themes. Law and social movements is very broad, as we can see, and in the future it might be useful to pick some aspect of that and either have or not have papers, but have people ready to speak to a point, that is defined by a group.
So I don't know whether your question also included, was there a place? I think I could say Georgetown would be happy on a periodic basis to host these kinds of things. Again, that's kind of an unofficial, I'm not the one who makes the decision, but Josh was so forthcoming with this, it's hard to imagine not being able to continue. So, I mean, I'm certainly willing to help organize something like that if it were here. But for that matter, if it was somewhere else also.
I like the intergenerational aspect, and I like the students, and then, I thought that was really,
Student question.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah, the students were.
Yeah.
And students, and then us.
And I think it would be unfair not to have students wherever it's held.
Yes.
Because
Agreed.
either what about those of them who want to be here,
Mhm.
right?
Or just want to learn about these kinds of things
Exactly.
in a
Right.
way
Yeah. So
that they don't in most
right.
classes.
I wouldn't, I mean, I don't think students have to be for the whole thing, but I wouldn't want to exclude students from.
Thank you.
So if anyone needs help with logistics, I'll stick around. If people need the subway or a cab stand or anything like that.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Okay.
Thank
You
you.
again.
Thanks.
That was great.
All right.